Well, let me open this workshop meeting.
Okay,
Looks like it's 11:34. All 5 board commissioners are here. Brandy, and then Joe. What's your last name,
Joe
Joe?
Mitchell,
Okay,
Parametrix.
I'll turn it over to you.
All right, awesome. Yeah, so just so everyone knows, my name is Joe Mitchell. I'm a senior engineer with Parametrix, and so I work with a team on the port's water pollution control facilities permit, and specifically on their OM&M plan. I think we chatted, I think it was last year, on with the farmers on farming best management practices. So Jake Madison and others were here. So today I'll be giving an update. This is a presentation that we gave to the industries and farmers on proposed permit modification that just went out earlier this week. It's related to soil nitrogen. So that's what I'll be sharing today. I've also got Lauren Greasy on the phone here, who is one of the technical leads in our team. So there's about 5 or 6 of us that work on this, but Lauren and I are kind of leading this portion of it. With that, I'll get started.
Oh, Joe, just a sec. I'm sorry, I didn't ask about people on Zoom. I failed to ask it. Are those all folks on your,
No,
well, Dale's not, I know.
and Raven is not. And I don't know who Dave Weber is.
Could you ask them to
Absolutely.
announce themselves?
So Dale, will have you introduce yourself?
Sure. Dale Penn with CFM Advocates. We represent the port in the capital.
Thank you. And Raven?
Hi, Raven Hayes, here on my own, just out of general interest. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Dave hung up? No problem. Okay, that looks like it's it.
Okay,
Okay,
I probably
Yeah.
hit the wrong button.
so this presentation is one we gave about 2 weeks ago to farmers and industry, and it's something that DEQ is also seeing. So what I want to emphasize is that the primary audience for this presentation was number one, DEQ, to go through the technicalities of the permit as it sits, and then what we'd be requesting in terms of permit modification. So there's several slides in here that are directly related to what the analysis that was done in the first iteration of the permit, which would have been back in 2022, and how we felt that some of those restrictions on non-growing season application were impacting or could have a potential impact groundwater quality. So that's like the first kind of piece. The next piece is if we're going to request a modification to the permit, what do we replace it with in a way that's in a manner that's protective of groundwater, and then what would that implementation process look like? And so that's particularly directed towards the farmers, because a lot of that work would require input from them on what their cropping plans are going to look like, the data that's collected, and then how the port and Parametrix working with the port actually does that analysis. And then the third is the industries, and the reason for that is part of that analysis was to look at what does this permit modification do for increasing capacity during the non-growing season? And based on, we did kind of a high level analysis, where does that put us for this upcoming season, this upcoming winter? And if the port is short on capacity, we want to make sure that the industries knew where we were at, so that we have a better understanding of what type of reduction flow we need to get there. So it's really trying to kind of address all the different parties. So some slides are going to be more technical in terms of like showing DEQ, here's why we think we should do this. And the other ones are, okay, if we were to have that, what does that mean for the industries and the farmers to basically bring this whole plan together? And then, of course, ask questions as we go. This is going to be, showing you data in the analysis, but feel free to chime in if you have any questions. So in terms of an outline, we'll be just doing a background on the permit requirements themselves, conceptual framework, and that's how we went about analyzing the specifics of one of the permit rules, the results of that analysis, and then from there, what do we suggest for a permit modification, and then assessing the risk associated with those changes, and that's looking at the risk of leaching or nitrogen, and then the next steps, which are actively happening right now. So the goals of this modification were to reduce 30-pound nitrate nitrogen violations, which I can mention here, and I'll talk more in detail what that means in a second. Reduce 75% soil moisture violations, and then increase the winter capacity. Okay, so the background on this, and I want to be clear, winter application during the non-growing season is going to cease. So it's going to cease in the, as of November 2025, it's going to go away. So there's not going to be any more land application during the winter. That's because the port has those 1.5 billion gallon storage ponds coming online. And then they're also going to be putting in secondary treatment. Part of the permit modification request, which I'm not going to be talking about in this presentation, but is to get an extension on the secondary treatment because there's delays in how quickly that can be built. But in the meantime, they're going to have that 1.5 billion gallons of storage coming online. And so they're going to be able to hold that water during the winter. So with all that said, under the MAO with the state, the port's allowed to land apply a certain amount during the winter. So what our analysis is looking at is what's the best way to manage that water given that current situation. This analysis is not meant to say, hey, we should continue across the state doing land application during the winter. That's not the part of guardrails on this. This is what's the best way to do this with this upcoming winter season under the MAO, and how do we protect groundwater given those constraints? So I just want to, and I want to make sure that was clear to like the industries and farmers as well, is that we're not, even though we're requesting this permit modification, we don't want this to be used as like a justification otherwhere in the state to say, oh, everyone should be able to do this. It's no, there's a very defined problem statement here. So that's the second part of this, which is we're doing this with the understanding that that's going to be, it's an interim measure under the compliance schedule in the permit. Okay, and then on the right hand side of the screen, it's probably pretty small up there, but this is right from the permit. So the specific one we're looking at is application sites where the sum of soil nitrate in the 4th and 5th foot is greater than 30 pounds per acre or prohibited from receiving ongoing season irrigation water. A second piece of that, which is really important, is that application sites where the soil moisture in the 4th foot of the soil profile is equal to 75% of the 4th foot water holding capacity cannot receive water. So those are two really key prohibitions. You can't have more than 30 pounds of nitrate in the 4th or 5th foot. So that's the bottom part of the soil profile. And you can't exceed the soil moisture in the 4th foot because otherwise both of those from DQ's perspective are looking at that increases the potential for that nitrogen to be, or nitrate to be leached to the groundwater. So our analysis is looking at, okay, is that, what's the basis for those requirements? Not the 75% moisture, we're not gonna attach that, that needs to stay, but what does the 30 pound do to the port's program? Brent, is there a way for me to not see this on?
Yeah,
Just
right there.
Oh, there we go.
And then you can move it up if you need to.
Okay, so the idea, the concept that we're looking at is DEQ previously did an assessment in 2021 of the winter application season. And it assumed that all the nitrogen in recharge water, irrigation water, so I think it's 70% of the total nitrogen would essentially be nitrate, and that water can leach. And it doesn't include or account for the water holding capacity of the soil. So it just assumes if you apply it, it's going to groundwater. That assessment didn't show how a 4th or 5th foot limit would reduce the potential for leaching. So it just said water in is water that can leach. And it didn't say anything about if you have more in the 4th and 5th foot, this would add this additional amount. And one thing I want to mention is if you go, it's in the permit fact sheet. So anyone on the call here can go look at it, but that assessment was predicting groundwater concentrations of nitrate that were 2 to 12 times higher than what's observed. So that that assessment done by DEQ of the winter application season that was done in 2021, right before the permit came out in 2022, and it was predicting 2 to 12 times higher than what's observed. And so from there, Parametrix said, well, okay, what's going on with that model? Like, what did they do? How did they get that 2 to 12 times greater? than what's actually predicted.
When you say observe, is that due to DEQ's testing of the 4th and 5th foot, or where do we get that information that it's not 12 times higher?
So my understanding in their tech memo is they were looking at actual groundwater concentrations at that time in wells. So
Okay.
actual well log data from wells.
Oh, okay.
And then that 2 to 12 times number is right from their own tech memo.
Okay, and
So I
that's a snapshot in time, and it's not ongoing from that time forward.
Exactly.
Okay. All right.
The point being is that if that's what their model's predicting, I would hope that it would be closer to the reality, right?
Mhm.
And we shared this with DQ. I mean, this is in no way intended to, you know, criticize their analysis, because hydrogeology is very complicated. And so if they're just trying to assess what the risk of winter application is, it's a fair assessment to try to quantify that. It's more of, is it calibrated to the real world? And I would say I think their own findings are saying, well, not necessarily, it's more complex than that.
Okay.
And to be fair with that too, we also are not doing a hydrogeological study here to show how this amount of nitrogen is gonna behave, how it's gonna reach a well. We do have some information that was submitted in the request for permit modification that does show some groundwater information. I can share that. It's not in this PowerPoint, but I have it pulled up. Where we try to use regional groundwater hydraulic conductivities to kind of say, if you get this much nitrogen, here's the range of nitrogen impacts you might expect. So we put that in the permit modification so that DEQ and the public understand with these typical farming practices or with winter application, here's the range you might expect. Again, not calibrated to, there's not a regional groundwater model that's built that we could actually, calibrate to.
Okay.
Okay, so that's the concept. What we said is, well, if they didn't consider the 4th and 5th foot, and they're considering all that nitrogen in the profile, all 5 feet, to be potentially mobile, then what if you have fields that have a lot of nitrate in all 5 feet, but they pass the 30-foot rule? And so what this chart is showing.
Oh, I'm sorry, Joe, you said 30-foot rule.
Meant 30 pound.
30-pound rule. 30-pound rule
Okay.
in the 4th and 5th foot. The 30-foot rule.
30 foot, yeah, that's crazy.
That's quite a test.
30-foot rule, yes. I will probably do that several times today. So what you're seeing in this graph is on the x-axis, that is the sum of soil nitrate in the 4th and 5th foot. And so that red line, dashed red line, is 30 pounds. Okay, and then on the y-axis, you have the sum of nitrate in the 5-foot profile. So that's all 5 feet of the soil. These are from fields that were included in the 2023 winter application program. So this already excludes fields that were ranked as high risk in the groundwater. So if they were next to it, if they were upstream from like a domestic well, they were immediately considered high risk and they were kicked out. Those were not included already. So these are just fields that passed that screening. And then they said, okay, from this set of fields, can we apply? The next thing that would be removed from here that Lauren, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think is included in here is if they had 75% soil moisture or 75% of the water holding capacity in the 4th foot, those also would have been excluded from the program. And so what this chart is showing is that each of those dots represent a field of that 30 of its concentration in the 4th and 5th foot versus the total nitrate. And so what you're seeing is that, so these fields are fields that pass the 30-pound rule, but they actually have relatively higher total nitrate in the profile. And then the size of these circles represents how much water holding capacity that field has. So these fields in the method that DEQ used, which is actually using a spreadsheet from the Department of Ecology in Washington, all of this nitrate would have been considered mobile to leach. And so what we were doing from Parametrix, we're saying, why is this a better situation that's allowed in the permit than something like this over here? So this field was kicked out of the program because it was above 30 pounds, but it has a lot of water holding capacity, and it's actually has a lot less nitrate in the total profile than these fields. And so as you go further out, these fields are high, both of it. They have high nitrate in the 4th and 5th foot, and they have a high total nitrate. So these ones are higher risk of leaching no matter what. But it's these fields on the margins that we say, look how many fields are in this region. This represents water holding capacity for the winter that could potentially receive water that has less total nitrate in the 5-foot profile. And they were kicked out compared to some of these fields that are sitting up here where these were allowed in. And so what we want to try to do is, can we capture this area using a risk-based approach where they only receive a certain amount of water so that you can prevent leaching from these fields, but you've increased the total capacity of the program. And I'll show why that's potentially beneficial to increase that area. So just from a conceptual framework, this is meant to be very simple, but if you think of each of these fields as a sponge, a 5-foot sponge, you've got a fixed amount of recycled water we're trying to dispose of. And so that's the MAO agreed volume. So I think the MAO allows up to, Lauren, I think it's 978 million gallons during the winter season. 2023, I think they put down like 750 or 800 million gallons.
Can you say that again, Joe?
Lauren, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I was gonna say, I think 2023, they put down about 785 million, and then the MAO volume is 948 million or something like that.
Thank you. That's why we had Lauren. Yep. Okay, so each of these fields has a unique water holding capacity, right? That's based on the type of soil that's in that field. And then each one also has a unique amount of nitrate in the soil that's dependent on what crop did they grow, how much nitrogen was applied the year before, what type of yield did they get from that crop. So some crops are going to take a lot of nitrogen out of the soil, some of them not so much. Crop residue, all sorts of things go into how much nitrate's left in that. So if you exceed, in the way it does get complex, soil moisture and water movement through the profile gets complex, but the way that the permit looks at it is essentially like buckets. Each foot is like a bucket. And once you fill up that bucket, the water from that bucket goes to the next bucket. And that's why that 4th foot rule is important, is because it says, once you get 75% in that 4th foot, you're getting really close to exceeding where it might go to the 5th foot and potentially leach, right? And so what we're looking at is, I'll go back to here. If you exceed that water holding capacity, you potentially mobilize that nitrate, and that can then go through the last foot and then eventually reach groundwater. Well, like I showed you with that previous one, let's say that 30-pound rule represents a fixed number of fields that I said was in the 2023 program. As you increase what's allowable in the 4th and 5th foot to 40 pounds, 50 pounds, 60 pounds, you bring in more fields that can receive water. Then that same fixed amount of volume is spread out along more fields, and you get, if it's managed properly and not exceeded, less overall leaching from each individual field. So you decrease the hydraulic leaching from each field, but there's a trade-off. There's an optimization point, because those additional fields might have more nitrate. And so even though you have a smaller amount of volume leaching, if it's at a higher concentration, you might get the same amount of mass leach. So what we were trying to figure out is, where's the sweet spot? If it was a 40-pound limit or a 50-pound limit, what would be the best way to allocate that water across the fields so that you reduce the overall leaching volume, but you also reduce the total mass of nitrate that's released? And so from a conceptual standpoint, and this is not meant to, you're not meant to be able to read all this, but this is in the permit. This is in our tech memo that was submitted with it. This is showing, again, that same amount of volume. Let's say you're at a certain, let's call this the 30-pound rule here on the left. You're putting that fixed amount of recycled water onto a smaller number of fields. And so the blue is representing, you're filling up that water holding capacity of that field. You're more likely to get a 75% moisture violation because the port has to put the water somewhere. And so if they have to apply it to that smaller amount of fields, they exceed the water holding capacity, you get higher leaching volume with a certain amount of nitrate. And then this is really important. The next piece of this is that the mixing happens over a smaller area of groundwater. And that groundwater is like an underwater river, right? It's hydraulic conductivity you can think of as like the flow rate, how fast that river is moving. So, and that's what I'll share later is, this area that we live in is a range of hydraulic conductivities depending on where we are. Some areas it's a slow river, some areas it's a really fast river because it's tied right to the Columbia, right? And so by putting more water on those small fields, you get potentially more leaching volume on those individual fields, and you're mixing with a smaller cross section of the river. And so therefore that river can be higher concentration of nitrate. So as you move out on this curve, on this rule, you see that you have less blue, which is meaning that you spread the water out, you're not exceeding water holding capacity. Therefore, the amount of actual leaching volume is less, but then you're also mixing it with a lot larger section of groundwater. So decreasing area means decreasing water holding capacity, means increased leaching volume, means potentially increasing groundwater nitrate concentration, and conversely, increasing area, you have increasing water holding capacity, decreasing leaching volume, and decreasing groundwater concentration. Okay, so what we did is we took the inclusion of fields from the 30-pound rule in the 4th and 5th foot and increased it to look at how much additional capacity we would get for each incremental change. So on the graph on the left here, you've got the 4th and 5th foot rule. So here's 30. This is where they were at last year. And then the gray line is the what happened in 2023. So the way, and I will mention that with this modeling, we kept it pretty simple. So what we did is we said, as of October 31st or November 2nd, whenever the last set of data from soil moisture came in, what fields were available. So if they violated a 70, or if they had too much water already in the profile, it was kicked out. Then we said, how much water is left over in that soil? And we just did a subtraction of water that was applied minus the water holding capacity at the start of the season. And then whatever is left over, we consider could potentially be leached, right? So what we're trying to work on now, and I can talk about this later, is we're trying to refine that to actually use forward predicting models to say, okay, if you get rain, if you get this much, what would the actual soil moisture be? So that way we can kind of better model the actual reality in the field. But for this assessment, what we're trying to do is show the principle of like what the trend would show. And then the rest of that comes down to more like operational details. How do we like hit a field right when it's ready to receive water, and then make sure we turn off the pivots so we don't exceed an amount. So just to clarify, so what it's showing is that if you were to increase that rule that's in the permit, you increase the land, and thereby you increase the water holding capacity for those fields. So this is showing that like at the 30-pound rule, you might have 350 million gallons available based on that starting soil moisture. As you increase that, you start to get kind of a sweet spot, what I call sweet spot, where you've only increased it to like, let's say between 40 and 60 pounds, but you've captured another 150 million gallons of capacity in the soil. At some point, it doesn't really matter how much more you increase this rule, you don't get much more capacity because all the fields are pretty much in there. And that goes back to that first chart I showed you. There's some fields that are way out there in the curve that we would never apply to, and you're not adding that much more capacity by including them. So then one thing I want to mention is these blue bland, again, I don't want to spend too much time unless you guys are interested, and I've got some additional slides, but what we also did is we then modeled this where we actually did like a Monte Carlo simulation where we said, okay, this is what actually happened in 2023, but what if we just randomly sampled from the fields and assigned out of a distribution of starting soil moistures, you think of it like a checkerboard. Every time I get a new distribution of pieces on that checkerboard, that's how many fields were available. Then we do it again, then we do it again, then we do it again, over and over, because we don't know if field 150 is going to be too wet or field 20 is going to be too wet, right? And by doing that thousands of times, you get like a distribution of what we think the capacity will be. And that's what these bands represent, is essentially these 10th and 90th percentile range of, we don't know what October or November is going to bring. So let's try to like take a randomized guess of what will be available given weather and all those other factors, right? So what that does is as you increase that rule, you start to decrease the potentially leachable volume in million gallons. And then the next piece of this is, well, that analysis didn't include the Farm 4 expansion, which was about 900 acres, and it also does not include the Farm 5 expansion, which is expected to be another like 700 acres. And so if you add, because we were just looking at 2023. So if you add in that 900 acres, what we're seeing is about a 50 million gallon increase in capacity. And so you can imagine if now we add another 700 acres, we're probably looking at like, 35 to 45 million gallons of additional capacity going into this season. And so again, that decreases the amount of volume that could be leached. Doesn't say anything about the nitrogen, it just says how much volume could be leached. So now let's translate that into how much mass, right? We said there's a sweet spot where we try to minimize volume, but also minimize total mass. So this graph on the left is showing as you increase that pound rule, what's a potentially leachable mass in pounds per acre? So here's that 30-pound rule, and it's right around here. So there's this big jump in the beginning. You might say, well, why would there be so much leaching in pounds per acre from a low regulatory limit on the rule? Well, that's because you're applying all of your water on only a couple fields, and all of that nitrate is going, right? As you increase the amount of fields, you decrease, now you're not flushing the whole column out, you're only letting a small incremental amount go. And again, there's that sweet spot. So if you look out here, once you hit to the 40 to 50, 40 to 60 range, you've captured most of that decrease in potentially leachable nitrate, and then it starts to taper off. So this is kind of where you've really dropped down in what you can leach kind of out in this range. And yeah, so this is in pounds per acre, and then this is in the total mass. And what this is showing, as it gets pretty steady here, is that once you've is that the mass, as you increase that rule, it's pretty steady, it's actually decreasing a little bit. So again, just because we're applying to fields that have over 30-pound rule, the total mass of nitrate is actually decreasing or is pretty steady. But on a pound per acre basis, it's going down a lot. So again, just getting back to this chart, it means that the amount of nitrate per acre is going down as you go out here. And that also means that it's mixing with a larger cross-section of groundwater, which is a good thing in terms of the dilution effect. Okay. So this slide is partly for the industry. So it's saying, okay, that's great. So if we increase it, we're going to have increased capacity and we're going to decrease the amount of nitrate that's going to leach. But what does that mean for the water holding capacity? Because we also don't want to violate the 75% rule. Well, these are different volumes of applied. So the blue line here represents the 2023 volume applied as you increase that rule. And this is the percent risk of exceeding that water holding capacity. Again, this is not looking at precipitation, evapotranspiration, anything. It's just saying beginning of the year starting, how much is left over, how much do we apply? And what it's showing is that really there was no way to avoid a moisture exceedance in 2023 because you just didn't have enough fields available, right? As you decrease the amount of volume of wastewater that you're trying to dispose of, that starts to go down. And so really, if we look at like a 50%, if the port had a 60-pound rule where they could at least apply up to fields that had a 60 pounds in the 4th and 5th foot, and they were only trying to dispose of 500 million gallons, they would have had about a 50-50% chance of not having a moisture exceedance. To get that down even further, you need only 400 million gallons. So this red line represents, you got 400 million gallons of wastewater you're trying to dispose of. Now, if you're at that 50 to 60, now you've got enough capacity. You can accept all that water without reasonably exceeding your water holding capacity. This is what we're trying to refine now with more forward-looking is, okay, is this realistic?
And I don't mean to be dense. I just need some big picture clarification here. So this is we're looking for a modification to get through the seasons where we have no holding capacity, correct? And that's the reason for this, because otherwise we're going to exceed, right? I don't mean to be losing focus here. Sorry about that.
No, not at all, not at all.
Is that correct then?
Yeah, so the winter application will stop November 2025.
Right.
That means we got this winter
Right.
and
But I know it's not going to happen, but in essence, you're designing a system to store it in fields instead of in a big pond. I mean.
Yeah.
In essence, it could work, it'd be a little less expensive than the big ponds, but we're going with the big ponds, I understand that. But
Yeah.
yeah, you're designing a system to hold it safely, yeah, with minimal nitrogen, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
In the
So,
field.
you're exactly right. So, it has to stop in November 2025, and that's
25,
why the
yes.
1.5 billion gallons are coming online.
Right,
And that's because and we talked with DEQ about this. Winter applications going away. I think it was, I'm not as familiar with kind of the history of this practice, but it's been done for a while and they're moving away from it because if you don't have crops taking up a lot of nitrogen during the winter, then you're applying that nitrate at a time when it's most vulnerable to leach. And usually if you've got precipitation during the winter anyway, it's more likely. So it's really, that's the riskiest period to be storing the water in the fields.
right.
So our analysis is saying, given that we have this winter to deal with,
This is the best way to, or a good way to do it.
how best can we manage this with the compliance schedule we're given? Yeah,
And it's really geared towards just this coming winter.
yes.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly, because again, November 2025, hopefully all that water stored and then used for crops when they most need that nitrogen. Right.
Right.
Does that answer your question though?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, yep. And then to emphasize though, part of the reason we're doing this is the farmers don't want to be associated with having to take water and have violations associated with their farms, right? So if the port has water and you guys need to get rid of it because we've got our ponds almost full, they've got to send it to a farm, and a farm's like, well, I don't have enough fields that are allowed under your program to apply to. So then if they're gonna apply that water and violate a 75% rule or a 30-pound rule, they're like, they have to, they have to take it. And they don't want to be put in that situation. And so
Sure.
what we're trying to show DEQ is, DEQ, if you move that rule and actually just showing this, I think what we're showing is that we're not really sure where the 30-pound rule came from. But it actually, in some instances, might be worse. Again, it's more field specific, but it might actually be worse than increasing that, but then just applying less water. Right, so again, coming back to here. Bring these fields in. But only apply a certain amount, so you don't exceed the leaching and everything.
Right.
But I think it's important to know that this not only represents an increased capacity, but it also represents operational flexibility. Because if you've only got 10 checkerboard pieces to smooth your pieces to, if one of them's about close to hitting 75% rule, you can only move to 9 other places. If you got 20 different spots, even though those other fields might only be able to take a small amount of water, at least you have another location to move to, right? So that's where it's not just the total capacity, it's also, can MIF call a farmer and say, we need to turn off farm 20, switch over to 22. Excuse me, but now we've got 10 other fields that are online and can take that water.
Reducing the overall risk to the water quality is, this sounds like this would work towards that as well.
Yeah, that's what when you look at those, and it's I didn't include it in here in the permit modification. Well, we try to be conservative with this. So we said, we assume that if you exceed the 3-foot water holding capacity, so the top 3 feet, then all of that nitrate in all 5 feet would be mobilized. So we said, we took the nitrate from all 5 feet, and we said, all that nitrate is actually in the 3-foot water holding capacity. So if you exceed that, all that nitrate is potentially mobile. And so that's what we're trying to say, like, and that kind of follows some of the same principles that DEQ used in their analysis. We just said you need to account for the water holding capacity when you're doing that analysis. Okay, so what does it mean? So our argument here is that removing the 30-pound rule increases the number of fields, which increases your water holding capacity. More fields is more flexibility to switch between the fields to avoid that 75% violation. More fields equals less nitrogen loading to individual fields. Because now you can actually, one of the concerns we have is that if you only have those 10 checkerboard pieces, the ones you're applying all that water to them, and now they have a lot of nitrogen, and then going to the next year, the farmer might be restricted on how much additional nitrogen they can apply for the crop needs, right? So now you've loaded it all up during the winter, and now in the spring, when the corn needs the nitrogen the most, or the summer, now you're like, well, we can't exceed our agronomic rate limit because we've already eaten that up. So that's the other issue that they run into. So more fields is less risk to groundwater. But I think one of the key findings from here is that it doesn't necessarily provide enough capacity to prevent all violations if they try to apply the entire volume that they applied in 2023. Right, and so that's the indicator to the industries is, hey, this permit modification is going to help, but it might not get the entire, they might not still have the entire capacity they need going in. And that's what we're trying to refine some of this to nail down that number. One thing the industry's mentioned is they would like to provide us with their anticipated volumes going into this winter, so we can try to incorporate that in and see if we get closer, especially on avoiding a 75% moisture rule.
So they talked about the 750 million gallons. Hey, maybe we can do something to get it down to 700 and 650 million, which
Right.
helps.
Yep,
overall cost.
there was no like commitments during that meeting, but just more of, we're looking at that on a day-to-day basis, and can we get you guys numbers? And I said, yeah, if you guys can give us numbers, we can rerun this. But then what we're trying to do is actually, we've got some of our teams working on actually modeling when you apply recycled water or wastewater or precipitation, what does that soil moisture profile actually look like? So that we can actually kind of predict forward how often are these fields going to become back available and then go offline, and then come available and then go offline, right? So that way we can have a better estimation of this throughout the year, whereas right now it's just October 31st, what's available, right? And that's not necessarily realistic, but that's the level that we've gotten to so far.
Is there any model for what crops are being grown during the winter? Or is there any crop being grown at all?
Yes, so there are definitely crops growing in winter, especially like hard red winter wheat and some others. And I'm going to talk about some of those in the next piece with the risk profile. One of the things we've gotten from the farmers is they have observed evapotranspiration during the winter for some crops. And most of the publicly available data and models don't show any of that. So once the water's on there, you don't really have a mechanism in our model to like hold that water out. They do have crops that are saying, yeah, it is consuming water and nitrogen during the winter, but like it's hard right now. And Lauren, feel free to chime in here. Because I haven't looked through the data on how flies come after me, on how we can build that in. But for the most part, winter is a lot of publicly, like, for example, the Agromet Hero station for Hermiston, they stopped measuring ET in like October. So they just don't even consider ET during the winter. But, if you get heavy precipitation, that could potentially take fields offline that I showed were online. And so that's a risk, right? If you've got a big rain event and then a bunch of fields go offline for a week, that's going to be an issue. So we want to try to build that into the probabilities.
So I have one question about, so you're basically just taking it from 30 pounds at a 3-foot level. And so your justification is water holding capacity of those other circles. Is that the justification that
Say that one
through
more
the
time.
DEQ? So the 30 pound rule, is that a 3-foot rule, or does it go to a 4 and 5? 30 pound rule at 3 feet?
30-pound rule applies to the sum of nitrate in the 4th and 5th foot.
4th and 5th. And you want to bump that to 40 to 60.
Actually, no, I haven't. That's what I'm about to talk about here. We're actually going to say we're going to exclude all fields that have greater than 150 in all 5 feet. So instead of having, and it actually translates about to like a 40-pound rule, so I'll show that again here. But what we're suggesting is that anything, we're gonna look at this. The y-axis rather than the x-axis. And then we're gonna replace it with a risk ranking on every single field. And so I'm gonna talk about the nitrogen index next, but so we're gonna replace that with a screen, just like they did for groundwater location. There's gonna be another index tool that's gonna evaluate every single field for their risk of leaching. But as a hard permit cutoff of just like we're not even gonna look at this, we're suggesting 150 for nitrate in all 5 feet is the cutoff. So right here would be any fields that are above 150 are immediately cut off. If you come across here and you look at what that entails, it's essentially a 40 pound. So anything below 150 could be looked at. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to receive water, because I'm going to talk about, we're going to use that to rank, give it a risk ranking. But anything out of this, we won't even look at. We just say it's out. There's no way it can be used. But as you can see, what that means is it just lets us look at these fields. It doesn't mean that they necessarily pass the screening. So that's what I'll show next is how that actually, how that's actually looked at.
150 in the total 5 feet equates roughly to 40, what you're saying?
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm looking at is like, technically we could look at these fields out here. But what I'll show you with the index tool is these would most likely get screened out. Okay, so what would we replace the 30-pound rule with? We'd replace it with a screening criteria that includes the available water holding capacity and starting soil moisture, the 4th and 5th foot soil nitrate concentration. So we're still looking at that at like a high level. But what we're going to be focusing more on, and I'll show you why as it relates to this index tool that we use, is the total soil nitrate concentration, because based on how DEQ previously looked at this, we consider all of that potentially mobile. And so we want to protect the entire profile. It includes results of the modeling leaching potential using some programs, and that's what I'm going to be sharing here shortly. And then best management practices. So there's specific things farmers do that can directly impact whether or not a field's going to leach. So one of them that I'll talk about is, do you have a 5 foot rooting crop depth in your rotation? And if you do, that dramatically, or that can really decrease your potential for leaching. There's some other parameters that I'll show here in a second. And then this is a little bit out of date because this was already submitted, but the port would submit a plan to DEQ for approval. So the permit modification went in, but then what will have to happen is now they're going to submit a plan by October 15th, but hopefully sooner, that actually goes through and ranks every single field on whether it should receive water or not based on this approach. And any monitoring, additional monitoring. So for example, part of this would be increasing the number of soil moisture monitors in the fields. And that way, right now they're required to have 2, but we want to increase that number on these fields so that they have a better feel for how much water is actually, what the soil moisture profile looks like. So that way you respect that 75% rule. Any of the forward modeling that we talked about, the timing and volume of the recycled water, and then again, the farming best management practices that they're using through that winter season. But things we cannot control, and again, this is partly for industries here, but climate conditions like heavy precipitation can throw fields out of the program, or at least out temporarily. Starting soil nitrate. So if you've got fields that come out in the early fall that are really high in nitrogen, they're going to be out of the program. And so it's really, hopefully if the farmers are managing like they usually do, the lower those values are, the less risk there is for leaching. You can always have operational challenges, and then agronomic rate. So underlying all of this is the fact that no matter what, they're only allowed to apply a certain amount to a certain crop. So you still can't you know, just because they're allowed to land apply to more fields doesn't mean they can exceed a nitrogen allowance for that field. So alfalfa has a cap, corn has a different cap, wheat has a different cap. They all have a total amounts of nitrogen that cannot be exceeded, and that doesn't change. Okay, any questions before I talk about what we want to replace? What would go into a winter plan? Okay, so our team looked at a lot of different tools. I think, is everyone here familiar with how GSI did the risk ranking for groundwater? Just high level, it's like 50%, you know, they come up with a weighted score. So if a field is upstream of a drinking water well, it's basically immediately kicked out because 50% of the weighting of the score goes towards whether it's upstream or well. So those are high risk. So all farm two, Greg Harris's farm, that's out because it's above a drinking water supply. So that it's out of the program, and it wouldn't be included in this program either because it's ranked high. So that's out. There's other factors that go into that. So what we're trying to do is come up with a similar screening, but this is looking at actual field by field leaching potential. And what we found is we came up with it's a publicly available tool through the USDA. It's called the nitrogen index. And we actually ran through this with the farmers beforehand to kind of screen through. And we're still working through using a previous data set to kind of assess it, but I can pull up some of the results from that. But what this is, it's a publicly available tool, so anyone here can download it and play around with it. But what it does is it has on the left there, you see all these different inputs. So you put in the crop type. It essentially looks at like 1 year of a rotation. So soil nitrogen, the rooting depth of crops, the soil types and hydrology, how much irrigation water. I put reused water in here, but actually what we did is we modeled reused water as a fertilizer, like a ammonium fertilizer, precipitation, and then it actually has inputs for whether you're doing a split application, controlled release, nitrification inhibitors, and then best management practices. So whether you're using a wheel line or a center pivot or furrow irrigation, if you're sticking to an agronomic rate and you're doing in-season tissue testing, application of frozen ground, your cultivation method, and whether or not there's deep root crops in rotation. So all of this information goes into this program, and the program will spit out a nitrogen balance, which the port's already required to do for its fields anyway. That's part of its annual reporting. It gives you a leaching index, nitrate leaching potential, aquifer risk, and then several other outputs. And so what it looks like, before I say what it looks like, the key here is, and what I want to emphasize is there's certain things that we can control. So like the farmers can control what type of crop they're going to be growing, whether they're rotating with deeper rooting crops, how much water is actually applied during the winter. That's something we can either turn up or turn down depending on the how much capacity a field has, and then fertilizer and best management practices. So part of this is for the farmers to understand, like, they have a direct impact on, they've been saying this, you know, they said, hey, we use all these best management practices. What I have tried to communicate is that this is a way to try to quantify those either qualitatively and quantitatively in a way that DEQ can kind of take that and say, okay, this is how these practices are directly either protecting or could be, I don't want to say damaging, but if they're not doing certain practices, it puts the field at higher risk of leaching. So it's trying to close that communication gap between what a farmer is doing in the field and what DEQ cares about in terms of groundwater protection. Okay, so each of these go directly into have an impact on the nitrogen balance and the leaching index. So this is what the output looks like. So it's going to generate here on the bottom of the screen an actual nitrogen balance, looking at the total nitrogen in, volatilization, denitrification, above ground uptake by a crop. And to be clear, this is not from a report, this is just a generic output showing it. But then what it does is it ranks these different transport mechanisms of nitrogen. So nitrate leaching has a scale, surface transport, so that's like runoff or something getting, you know, to a water body, and then atmospheric, so that's related to air. And what we care primarily about is this nitrate leaching index. So this represents very low, low, medium, high, and very high. I'm gonna pull up the spreadsheet just to show you guys what that looks like as our first pass at this, but essentially what would happen is we'd collect that data, and most of it we already have from the farmers on the type of inputs that we need for that program. And that goes through all their farming practices and the crops and the expected yields and everything. Goes in the program. That then generates this index for every single field. And then we rank them, just like GSI did for groundwater, using that criteria. Then we would only consider fields that are in the medium, low, or very low for leaching potential to be acceptable. So like the very high and the highs would be kicked out. They wouldn't be able to accept water during the winter season. The screening criteria would go in an operations plan to DQ for approval before the non-growing season begins. So this is kind of jumping ahead. So what I want to do is real quickly pull up. Okay, so here's the actual text in the, excuse me, text in the modification request. So application sites must be ranked and evaluated according to the presence and location of nitrogen and moisture in the soil profile, water holding capacity, modeled nitrate leaching potential using publicly available models and other factors. The port shall submit a non-growing season irrigation plan on or before October 15th of each year for DQ approval prior to applying. And then they have to follow that plan. And application sites are prohibited from receiving non-growing season irrigation if they're ranked as high risk in accordance with that plan. So any of those fields that I just showed that would be ranked as high or very high would be kicked out. And we would submit that plan for DQ approval.
So you're saying this plan could continue past 2025 or into?
Yeah,
It could be a part of the picture still?
yeah, again, it should be done in November 25.
Right,
Because it goes away. Like if they're not gonna be land applying during the winter, there's no reason to put this plan forward, right?
right.
Because there's no winter
But
application.
it sounded like it was a continuing, one of your paragraphs you read, continuing into the future, or
No, I think you're right. That's a great point. I think it's written because the assumption is if they were to ever do winter application, they would need to do
they do
this.
this, okay.
They would need to do this. So it's unlimited, even though
It's going.
it should be stopped.
Should be
right?
stopped, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great point, though. You know, I'm not sure that we thought of that when we, well, I think we did actually, Lauren.
Is there a mechanism at all to make adjustments through the winter season? Cause you're putting a plan together in October. And there might be a very light winter all the way to Christmas. Where there's crops still growing up through November, you know, is there a way to
Yep, I'm glad.
account for that?
We talked with the farmers about that, and then we just talked with DQ about that earlier this week.
Okay,
And what we've come up with, and that's where I was gonna pull up the,
I guess in essence, it makes a medium risk field, maybe kick it down to low risk. Oh, you know, or something like that, or
no. Yeah, no, you're spot on. So, let me, wait a minute, where is this? What we came up with, what the discussions we had, we were trying to think about what does operationally make the most sense, because, and DQ understands this definitely, and so do the farmers, is that's a lot of data to have to try to collect when you got crops being harvested, and then what, turn around by October 15th, that's a fast turnaround. Because we have to be able to do our due diligence on QCing the data and making sure everything's right. So what the plan is, and that would be included in the, let me see if this is. Nope, that's not one. We want to do a forward-looking a forward-looking model. So when we rank these, we're gonna take the soil nitrogen data from the last soil sample. So that would be either August, September, or October. So what we're gonna do is submit a plan to DEQ with all the fields that do have data that we're able to complete the model on. And then any fields that we don't have the soil data yet will be TBD. As those come in, we'll submit a second batch of those risk rankings. So those fields won't receive water until they've been approved by DEQ. But we're gonna wait until we have that soil data.
Okay.
And then where it gets a little tricky and why we thought about just doing a looking back to a rank, because it's similar to what's like last year's winter program is gonna be similar to this year's program. But that means we need to use forward-looking, like anticipated yield, anticipated tissue nitrogen, anticipated precipitation, like, so there's some uncertainty in those numbers. But we think that, and I think DEQ agrees with this, that's a better snapshot of what the risk should be during that winter. So basically, we'll have one submittal with the data we have on October 15th. And then as the next set of fields comes in, that'll be a second one. So it's a little bit adaptive in that sense where we're trying to use the most up-to-date data, and those fields will be approved once we get those submitted. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
There's been quite a bit of back and forth on that, just because we want to make sure that for everyone's sake, that you don't have a bunch of multiple submittals that confuse everyone, but also make sure we're using the most recent and relevant data.
I think, and follow-up question to Joe's, so December 31st, say there's been a drought in the winter. Is there an opportunity to say, well, there's, this model, we based it on regular precipitation, and now that didn't happen. December 31st, we're gonna make a new plan for the last 2 months of the winter based on that model.
So that's a good question. I don't think that would impact it that much because the screen will be based on like what we anticipate the precipitation to be. And so most of the fields, and based on what we're seeing, most of the fields should be included based on that, or most of the available fields, I'm not talking about nitrate, but just in terms of like the hydraulic load should be included. Where that would come into play is in the operations plan, it'll say that they can apply to fields as long as that 75% rule is maintained. So if there's low precipitation, it just means that those fields can keep accepting water until they reach that amount. So that just means that we probably would have more capacity than we anticipated. It wouldn't necessarily change the index ranking.
Okay.
The index ranking is probably going to be pretty fixed for that given field, because it's going to be more sensitive to like what type of crop, the starting soil nitrate, that type of thing. Whereas precipitation wouldn't have as big of an impact on it. It would just mean that operationally they can go apply more water because it's really dry.
The testing you're talking about is really the soil and moisture of the soil. It has really not too much to do with how much precipitation.
It does, but what it looks at is precipitation before the crop is growing, and then precipitation after the crop's in. And then it also looks at how much irrigation water was put on before the crop and then after the crop. So it does, but, and Lauren, feel free to chime in here. I'm not seeing that the model is really sensitive to that. I think it's gonna be more sensitive to the total nitrate in the soil, which is definitely where we're seeing the risk would come up. So with that, I'm going to quickly share this spreadsheet. Oops.
What's the anticipated response time from DEQ? Any ideas?
We also talked about that because obviously October 15th is a pretty drop dead last day, because they've got 2 weeks then to turn around before November 1st. So look, I think what we have going for us is that we've been communicating, like they've seen this spreadsheet, they understand what we're doing ahead of time. And I think, I don't want to speak for the board here, but I think we'd probably submit like a draft ahead of time, showing them especially the operational practices and the content. They already know what the index looks like. So that way they understand how we scored, all of that ahead of time, and then it's really that submittal on October 1st or October 15th won't be surprising to them at all. It'll be more like, here's the fields that are in and out, so they can approve that relatively quickly. But the content and actual, what the boots on the ground are gonna look like based on those findings should be pretty well established. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, like, it's gonna outline, you know, we anticipate that these fields can handle this much water. And then if they have to manage in the top 3 feet water holding capacity. So if they start seeing an increase in the 4th foot, they're gonna stop irrigation. Like, those types of things are gonna be written out. So as long as DEQ agrees with those, how it translates, then I think we're gonna be okay.
What? Talking about that bad scenario, you go through this, and then you run up against the limit and there's more water to be, what's gonna happen with that?
I think that's the one, right?
That's the one, yeah,
Yeah, that's the question.
okay,
So we're trying to refine that to
to
understand.
get it, to make it work.
We're trying to understand
Okay.
how much they can handle. With some of the uncertainties that you're mentioning, what if we have a bad scenario? But at the end of the day, I think there's gonna have to be, you know, feedback from the port to the industries on if we don't have capacity. You know,
This year.
Yeah.
Yeah,
so, and I think that's what the industry, I think they're trying to get us some of that data. So we can kind of help, like, okay, if you guys get to here. If you're able to conserve your water down to this amount, do we think we're gonna have that capacity? But that, I mean, that's an unknown for us too, and that's why we're trying to communicate that that's a big risk still. Even with this, and I think is an improvement for water quality and the approach, it doesn't necessarily get you all the way.
okay.
How much more does this model give for capacity of water than the 23 plan?
So I think it was, what we were seeing is it goes from about 350 up to, again, looking at the start of the season, not taking into account precipitation and everything, but there it is. 2023 was about 350 million gallons, again, right at the start of the season, what could have been held. That increases up to about 500 million gallons. I think under this, about 500 million gallons in this framework. When you include the farm four expansion, which is through, that's part of the modification. Or sorry, no, that's already in. That's another 900 acres, so that's another 50 million gallons.
So we're at 550.
And then another 700 acres for Farm 5 expansion. So Lauren, based on our looking at this one, well, 2023 when you compare it to our predicted, which is, I think our predicted is a lot more conservative, it's showing lower. But if they were at 500 million based on 2023, that puts you at 550 with the Farm 4 expansion, and then another, let's say 40 million gallons for Farm 5 expansion. Now you're at just under 600 gallons.
And you think the 500 starting point is conservative or something? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so when we did a bunch of random checkerboard pieces, that's where we're getting this model blue line bands. This is what actually happened. And so ours is it agrees kind of lower down here, but as you go out, we're predicting less capacity than what was observed in 2023. So I like to think that we are gonna have that 500 million gallons, but again, that's why we're gonna try to get
And we were at 758.
that's what was applied in 2023. So, you know, we're looking at 150, 200 million gallons, maybe in there, that range. Okay, just wanted to share this real quickly, so. And. Yeah, I realize most people probably can't read that. Yeah, so I'll try to go through this pretty quickly, but this is a very large spreadsheet where we took all of our 2022 to 2023 winter season data that we already had. And what we're trying to do is like run through the screen criteria to see, does it work? Like, what does it take to put in this? And so we went through, Lauren, I don't think, have we finished farm 3? I don't think we have.
No, we didn't finish farm 3.
So we got through all farm 4, all farm 5. And I think part of 3 and field 1, and then farm 2 obviously is out. So it's going through every single one of these. There's a lot of them. Looking at.
Farm 2 is out because of the GSI ranking. Is that-
Yep, which is column E here, which is saying, was it high, medium, or low?
Right.
Based on the GSI ranking. Go through, and again, I won't pay too much attention, or I won't go into too much detail, but we actually took the yields and the percent nitrogen removed from the crops and put those directly in, like the program lets you say, what crop did you grow? And then it assumes how much nitrogen we released. Well, we actually have field specific data. So we told it, nope, this is what the farmer actually measured and how much nitrate was removed. And put all those in. We looked at crop residues. Here's all the soil nitrogen that was in the system, nitrate and ammonium. We looked at all of the nitrogen in the 5-foot profile. And pre-plant and post-plant irrigation. We treated reused water as a fertilizer. And then we have a separate fertilizer, like if they actually use fertilizer, we also calculated that. Bunch of other hydrologic characteristics. And then another thing I want to mention is it actually has a section for, it's called offsite factors. And this is actually looking at risk to the aquifer. So we had GSI who put together the groundwater screening criteria, tell us based on each farm what the travel time to the aquifer, position of the aquifer, and vulnerability of the aquifer is. And again, this program is very high level. It's like, are you next to groundwater or next to drinking water, potentially next to drinking water, or like obviously next to groundwater or drinking water, and it's like it's really high risk. So we did that for each field. So it's taking another, it's building that into the risk assessment is what's that location. So it's kind of doubling that effort again, but we included that. And it looks at what the rotation is. So a lot of them are 5-foot rotation and they're rotated with a deeper crop. Some of these are less than 2 foot and a rotation with deeper crop. So that goes into reducing the risk of leaching. Then they also look at the yield goal respective to a university rate. And what I mean by that is that's essentially the agronomic rate. Well, the farmers are already doing the best thing you can select in this program, which is they're using a yield goal that's based on an agronomic rate, and they're doing an in-season tissue soil test. So right there, they're already like they're scoring really high on that, which is part of the reason I was saying is this is just codifying something you guys are already doing, right? And getting credit for it. So here's the outputs, and what it does, it based on that, we calculate that nitrogen leaching index, which is that score that I shared with you in that screenshot. You know, it's like those different bars with different colors. And what we did is we tried to we have residual data. So we have the nitrogen data after they harvest a crop. And so what we did is we would run the model and then look at what is the modeled residual nitrogen in the soil versus what was actually measured. And some of these values are actually really good, like less, 12% different than what was actually measured. Some of them 50% off, some of them are a lot higher. Some of them are right on. The point in this, and some of these we didn't actually do yet, so that's why those are off. But the point is that some of these, the model is actually pretty close. We always made sure that the nitrogen into the system was basically agreed with what was actually done. Sometimes there's a little difference on how the program calculates crop residue. And we've got notes here. So what this comes out as is this, you think this is a very large if-then statement. So what's the GSI risk to groundwater? If it's low or medium, it's potentially in the program, or it's in the program, or it's potentially in the program. If it's high, it's out. So it's out, it's kicked out. this is the 4th and 5th foot nitrate. Based on the rule previously. And here is the 5-foot nitrate profile. This is what the new program. So these fields had 179, 160 pounds of nitrate. These are automatically out. They can't accept, they're not going to be in the program.
Based on the growing season this year, at the end of,
For winter application,
yeah,
winter application.
yeah, going into the plan for winter application,
Yep. So,
using data from this year.
yep. So those would be out. Yep. What you're seeing is they also would have violated the 4th and 5th foot, right? Here's some fields where these violated the 4th and 5th foot, but they actually had less than 150, so they actually passed. So they're low. They passed. They passed the index ranking, so technically those could be in the program. So that's where like that's an area increase the area there. Trying to find some that match up really well. So here's some fields where, so you look at this one has 37 pounds of nitrate in the 4th and 5th foot. So it's over the limit of the old rule. It's 155, so it would be out of the program. But then the index also calculated as a 40, which is also a high risk. So this one, it didn't pass the 30-pound rule. It wouldn't pass our proposed 150-pound rule. And our index also caught it saying, this is also too high, it should be out. There's some other ones down here where you've got, yeah, here's one. Well, I don't know if this one got all the way through, but
There's
you'll
a
see.
few on farm 4 that are good to point out, I think.
Is it down here? Oh, yeah, right in this region.
Yeah, those ones.
Yep. So the some of these are pretty far out on the 4th and 5th rule. They're still violating the 150-pound rule, and then you're seeing these are starting to score a lot higher on that index ranking. That's why they're colored 32, 30, so 36. This one would be out for sure. These ones are kind of in that, they're still in the low risk, but we would have kicked them out because of the total nitrate. So what that does is you've got this question, is the field eligible for non-growing season? And it's checking all of these conditions to make sure it's got to be low, it's got to pass this rule, and it's got to pass the index. And if it is, it can receive water. And then I think, Lauren, I think we talked about this too much, but there's probably going to be some discretion too on if something's really close and we feel like it's, we'd still most likely look at that 4th and 5th foot. If it's really high and it doesn't add much more water holding capacity, just because it passes, we might still consider that out because it's not really, there's not enough volume in that field to justify applying to it when you've still got that kind of underlying risk.
So based on the new proposed rules, what did this table show you as far as growth and application acres?
Yeah, so that's right here.
Okay.
Okay, so we've, I want to be clear on this. Yeah, oh, okay.
I'm not leaving.
It's just getting good, right? No, we pulled out the Excel sheet. Okay, so this is, I want to highlight here, we've only modeled 87 fields and there's 101. So we're about what is that, about 80%, almost 90% of the fields, right? What it did though, is when you look at the total that was increased, it increased the program by just under 1,500 acres. That would have been included now to receive water that hadn't before. And again, that's screening out the high nitrate, that's looking at the index, and then that provides additional water holding capacity and then the flexibility to switch between fields. And so I'm guessing that's probably a little higher than 1,500. If we did the rest of the fields, it'd probably be a little bit higher than that. And again, that doesn't include, Lauren, this was just from 2002 to 2023. So it's not looking at Farm 4 or Farm 5 expansions either.
Correct.
Yep. Yep. And again, you know, each field, a lot of the fields are different acres too. So one field you add might only be 30 acres, but you got another one that's 120. So that's a lot more water holding capacity too. So
How many million gallons do you equate per acre? You have a calculator for that?
That is a good question. So Lauren, the water holding capacity and 3 feet is probably about 3 inches per acre. After you count,
Yeah. Maybe a little, are you accounting for soil moisture?
assuming a starting soil moisture of like 60%.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
3 inches, so I can't do this in my head, but 3 inches per acre. You multiply that by, hey, I can't do it in my head, but you can convert that to gallons pretty quickly. She's got it, yeah. Yeah, I'm trying to think if, yeah, Lauren, if we have that, we don't have that in the presentation. Just the total curve.
No, yeah, I mean, you can kind of look at the curve with the area and capacity and see, as the area increases about 1,500 acres. I mean, you're gonna get, what is that, like 80 million gallons-ish capacity?
Oh, right, yeah, so the increase in farm 4 was 900 acres and it was about 50 million gallons.
Yeah.
So 50 million divided by 900, I'll tell you. So it's probably gonna be about 500,000 gallons per acre. Just under that. Okay, that's all I had. Is there any questions or presentation at all, or? Got some additional slides too, but
I think the thing that you said last time that stood out to me the most, because this is all above my head, and I think kind of goes to your question when you were asking the 30-foot now is 40-foot. I think what you said to me was, we're taking away the hard and fast rule of 30-foot, so there's just no ifs, ands, or buts about it, to more of a comprehensive screening, so there won't be a hard and fast rule, it would be more of, we're looking at everything now. Instead of just this, nope.
Yeah.
Is how you explained it to me, that made more sense, so it'll be a more comprehensive look at everything.
Yep.
To compute whether it's a safe field to put it on.
Yep. And
That made sense to me for somebody who doesn't understand most of this.
yeah, and it really gets back to that first chart I showed, which is just, Lauren and I didn't find anything in the permit fact sheet that said why 30 pounds was picked. So it's kind of like, why is that there in the first place, right? Is it really protecting groundwater? And so what we're trying to look at is, how does it directly relate to nitrate leaching? And I think what we're showing is, there's a lot of other factors that go into that. If it's above 30 pounds of nitrate, but what if you have a 5-foot rooted crop? Or what if it all depends, and I think the farmers are really good at highlighting this, but each farm has a whole suite of practices they use to figure out where that field's at and what crop should be in there and these other things. And all we want to do is make sure that everything is considered when evaluating that specific field for leaching. When you have this arbitrary cutoff that we're not really sure what it's based on, that's impacting how many fields are available and potentially making certain areas more problematic. And so, yes, we're replacing 30 pound with a individualized field screening. The one hard cutoff that we did put in, originally we didn't have it, but we put it in, is the 150. Because we felt that the 150 and the total 5 feet, that's like a no, that's just like a, nope, we're not gonna pass that. And it actually comes, I didn't want to pull this up, so where that comes from. This is the kind of the publication. There's a bunch of them on the nitrogen index because they've done it. It's used internationally. They've calibrated it to actual field data. But if you come through this paper, there's actually a screening table. And so it'll ask each of these questions, and then it'll assign a, low, medium, high, very high risk for each of those transport mechanisms I mentioned, which is nitrate leaching, surface transport, etc. So every single field, we get a printout that shows where it scored in every single one of these. And so you've got a water leaching index, which is essentially the hydraulic, how much water could leach. Then you've got a nitrogen available to leach. So that's essentially how much nitrate's there that could leach. Doesn't necessarily actually leach, but it could. And then the estimated nitrate leaching. When you look at this, it actually translates really well to that graph I showed you guys. Very high is greater than 150 pounds of nitrate per acre. It's considered very high leaching potential based on this work by USDA and a lot of others. And then also the estimated nitrate leaching very high is 150. So our reasoning is just, let's cut, those are out. I think we've got another data point. This actually is reference to something. I think I would have questions for them on why 150, why specifically 150 did they pick this? But I think, and Lauren, feel free to chime in here, but I think part of this is based on just their experience with farming and nitrogen. What is the levels that they should be really looking out for of, once you're past this threshold, there's a good chance that you're going to have an impact on groundwater. So all we're saying is if you're down in this region, this is where your risk to groundwater is reduced. These ones in that 100 to 150 range, we should be really keeping our eyes on, right? If it's below 150, but it's in that 100 range.
So, yeah. So we're talking about what's there and how much water, how much nitrogen's in the recycled water that we want to put on.
Yeah, so
Does that vary or is it?
yeah, so the recycled water itself is it's about, when it comes out of anaerobic digesters, it's around 90 milligrams per liter of total nitrogen. So that's TKN plus nitrate. About 80% of that is ammonium. And less than 1 milligram per liter is nitrate.
Okay.
So when we did this model, we didn't look at how much ammonium could be, most of it's ammonium. We looked at how much nitrate from that would be added, because nitrate's the most mobile form there. Once that ammonium hits the field, it can mineralize and then convert to nitrate.
Okay. But so so like the biggest factor here is the water itself. That's what. There's only so much holding capacity in the soil. It's not what nitrates are being put on, it's how much water is being put on.
Yeah, because
Is the bigger factor.
yes, because and part of what we did when we did the analysis, and we told DEQ this, we just looked at how much nitrate in that 5-foot profile would be displaced by that water. When you add that hydraulic water, how much of it's going to push that nitrate?
But it's not nitrates being put on, it's the nitrates that are there.
Yeah,
Okay.
yep. Yeah, it's only like 1 milligram per liter of the nitrate. Lauren, I can't remember it.
Okay.
In the cases where you completely exceed the water holding capacity, you would have some of that recycled water leaching, but we didn't include that we didn't calculate that ammonium that would leach.
Okay.
Because we assume that that's pretty much going to be fixed into the soil, right? So it'd only be the nitrate that could leach.
Okay.
And Lauren, I think that's fairly consistent with the DEQ's assessment, except they just assumed 70% of the nitrogen would be mobile.
Oh,
Right,
Yeah.
so when they did their analysis, they said, if you've got 100 milligrams per liter of ammonium or just TKN, 70% of that would be essentially nitrate that could go, which is just not really true in the winter. Right, because it's not gonna all mobilize.
right. I don't remember. I used to know what the cycles are, ammonium and how it converts to everything else.
Yep, so your TKN includes ammonium in it, and so that's gonna slowly that organic fraction of that's gonna be ammonium. And then once the ammonium's in the field, that'll start to mineralize into nitrate.
Nitrate, right.
And then nitrate's the one that's just really mobile.
What's the conversion from parts per million to pounds?
Part per million to pounds. In the Port of Morrow, it's about 4.
27? Oh,
Well, so if you're, are you talking about in the soil or the water?
in the water.
Let's see,
Is it
it'd
27,
be
28?
8, I think it'd be 8 point, so if you go, no, that's a million pounds per day.
I looked
That
at
could be 8.34 to go from milligrams per liter to pounds per acre. With. Not sure,
I think it was for every 10 parts per million, that it's 27 pounds.
27 pounds.
Yeah.
I think that's what Gina uses for MRCS. So.
With that analysis, can you explain the agronomic rates? And how any of this model is including agronomic rate?
So we're not looking at, so yeah, the agronomic rate is a cap of nitrogen that a specific crop can receive during its growing season. So for alfalfa, depending on the yield, can range, can be like 400 pounds of 400 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Corn has a different agronomic rate, and so those are the amounts that cannot be exceeded within the growing season, otherwise the port gets violation for it. This analysis isn't looking at if those are going to be exceeded or not. It's only looking at how that water could be spread out. So I think in most cases, you wouldn't have an exceedance of the agronomic rate during the winter season. The issue would be if you load up the nitrogen during the winter, then the following spring and summer, when they want to apply to give the nitrogen to the crops when they need it, they would be limited on how much they could give it during the growing season. So they wouldn't exceed it. They would stop before they exceed the agronomic rate. The problem is they might have reduced yield and nitrogen removal from that crop.
So is that being looked at
We're
for the spring? I guess?
Yeah, not so much for the spring rate because DQ is not really moving on agronomic rates. I think those are pretty set right now. We have discussed with them some options. So we're working with Farm 4 on some pilot studies where they were approved by DQ to like split a field in half and do higher rate on one half and then the permanent rate on the other. And we were just getting that data back within the last couple of weeks. And so we'll be working with the farmers to put together an actual report to show whether that higher rate was justified. So that's the one avenue they have is the pilot study mechanism, which is controlled experiments on certain farms to look at, or certain fields to look at a specific crop. Any general increases in agronomic rate aren't going to happen, as far as I know. And then the only other thing we're doing is with those pilot studies, there's some other programs that are publicly available for this specific application where I think we're meeting with the farmers on Thursday of this week to look at what type of data that can be put into some of these programs and to look at like a specific cultivar, a specific crop and what that nitrogen uptake could be. And it considers all these other factors that we're mentioning, like leaching potential and that kind of stuff. So the idea with that is to take farm specific data and yields, put them through a model to show if that increase in that economic rate is still protective of groundwater and using the site specific data to justify that either way. So we're kind of working on a framework for that, but it's not all put together yet.
Our past experiences that farmers, what's the question, don't exceed the agronomic rate, including the nitrogen that's in the water. Is that correct or not?
Sorry, say that again.
Agronomic rate, it's basically observed, or that's our past history. Is that correct? The last year or two? There's no application above and beyond the agronomic rate.
It has happened this last year that they had several agronomic rate exceedances. I think some of that was, so what goes into the agronomic rate is the nitrogen in the soil, plus the water, plus the nitrogen that's applied in either reuse water, irrigation water, plus crop residue, plus manure, plus fertilizer, all these other inputs. They were exceeded. Some of them were just like a pivot didn't get turned off soon enough, right? So they had an exceedance. Some of it was, I guess some of them got removed. So halfway through the season, there was a accounting method that because of the plan got approved, we started including crop residues, which added nitrogen to the system, but the farmers already made decisions about applying nitrogen, so then they got, should they exceeded, we talked with DQ and they were like, yeah, these aren't violations, it was you can't be penalized for a nitrogen that was, retroactively, right? And so we went through there, but I think some of them were just a couple of over applications, some of that is just communication. Some of it could be flow meter related, exceedances. So that's why we're trying to reduce those this next season. Yeah. Actually, on that point, another important modification we got approved was the farmers have been using TKN as total kildal nitrogen, and in November of 23, the port had to go from using for their loading calculations, they were allowed to do 70% of the TKN was the actual amount that was applied. And the reason for that is only a fraction of that's actually plant available, right? So the farmers, when you apply that nitrogen, only like 70% is actually available to the plants. The rest of it's like, material that will maybe eventually be plant available, but it takes a lot of time. So the farmers can't really plan if you use 100%. And so the way that the permit was written previously is it justified that 70% because the soil sampling would capture that additional nitrogen as it mineralizes into a plant available form. Well, as of November of 23, DQ is going to require that 100% of TKN needed to be calculated in the loading. Well, TKN can be up and down coming out of the digesters, and it's also not 100% plant available. And so the farmers were saying, we're not going to have enough nitrogen. Like you're saying we're putting this much on, but the amount that's actually available to crops is not true. So now we're going to have issues. And so what we requested is that the port measure ammonium, which is plant available right away. So measure ammonium and nitrate. Those are a lot steadier, consistent concentrations. And so use that for the loading calculations, knowing that the difference between the TKN and the ammonium would be captured in soil sampling. And that soil sampling goes into the agronomic rate anyway. So we want to make sure they're not double counting TKN that 100% is applied right now, and then it degrades, shows up in a soil sample later and gets counted again. So that was the request we put in, and DQ approved that until November of this year. And we're still talking to them about why they approved it, and then they want to go back to 100% November 2024, and we're not sure why. So we're talking to them about why they would switch back.
So that's part of the permit modification also request, or?
Not in this one. I think this is just gonna be a clarification on why they're switching back. Because yeah, the argument is you're double counting, but also if the farmers have to use the most recent data every week and TKN is going up and down, how are you supposed to plan your agronomic rate if your effluent concentration is going all crazy? Well, ammonium is a lot more steady. And so we said, let's use a 4-week moving average for that calculation. So that way the farmers have a smooth concentration to plan for. And so those are the type of operational things we're trying to get. So that way agronomic rates aren't violated just because you had 90 TKN one day and then 50 the next day, and then 75 the next day. And it's like, how are you supposed to plan your loading rates with that variability, right?
Any other questions for Joe? Anybody else? Okay, well, thanks for the presentation.
Yeah.
Yes, we
thank you,
appreciate
Joe.
it. Thank you.
And so is it 1:09? I'll adjourn this workshop.